And we're live with our 265th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on social media, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on social media. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Super excited to have Scott on the podcast today. But just have a few items to announce before we jump into that. I think first things first, there is going to be a training opportunity for Ken and I's new course, Harnessing LLMs for Application Security. We're going to be doing this virtually the end of next week. We're just, we've got most of the content already done. Want to turn it around and make sure that people are, have an opportunity to check that out. So if you haven't seen it yet, it's now posted, and you can sign up. You can register at training.absoluteappsec. I'm trying to put the link in here, .com.
Yeah. While you're doing that, I can explain a little bit more and add a little more color. We did. So obviously we had training around generative AI inside of our practical secure code review course. We'll still keep that in the secure code review course. What we did realize is that we have so much to share in that space that the secure code review course it's not for all the use cases that we demonstrate. It's just not the right place for it. So we needed a dedicated course for it. So that's our thinking here. Is we're going to show you how to do some threat modeling, how to analyze code, test your analysis, and then some other sort of like extrapolating what you need from code bases and all kinds of fun stuff. So there's a lot of content that we're going to go through, and I'm glad we have a dedicated course because it's a lot to pack into the secure code review course.
Yes. But it is up and available. This one there will be additional opportunities there as well. Again, this is the first virtual course, but it's a good way to get your feet wet with LLMs, with generative AI. If you've ever wondered what lane chain is or what RAG is, how to actually use it in application security, this is where you can learn. So that will be available. So I think that's November 7th and 8th. So that's next Thursday, Friday. It's a 2-day course. And even in 2 days, there's a lot to cover, right? Sign up if you are interested. If you have questions, jump into Slack, hit up either me or Ken about what's going on with it, and we'd love to talk through it. Besides that, I will be at DeepSec in a couple of weeks. If anyone is going to be in Vienna or in Munich, I'm pretty sure I'm going to meet up with Juan from Slack as well, because he's always around, which will be fun. But if anyone else will be there, I'd love to catch up along those lines. Ken, anything else that you have attended recently, or what are your plans?
Oh man, yeah. So I think the last one I attended was OWASP SF. But in terms of any plans, I'm trying my best not to travel right now. There's a couple of trips I can't get around, but yeah. I mean, I'm trying to. I did submit for CactusCon, and I think by the end of this week, if you plan on submitting to ShmooCon, which is held in my neck of the woods, which Juan's in my neck of the woods right now, by the way. But in any case, if you want to submit to ShmooCon, I believe the deadline for that, and I am submitting for that, is next or maybe this week or something along those lines. I don't know. I put it down somewhere, but let's see here. Yeah, ShmooCon call for papers.
Man, I'm thinking I forgot to submit to CactusCon. Yeah, dang it. So.
Oh no, the CFP already closed for ShmooCon. Well, I guess I missed that one.
Yeah,
man, that stinks. Must have been it looks like it was the day before the CactusCon one was due, and I just didn't have it on my calendar. Oof. In any case,
it looks like ShmooCon call for speakers got extended to the 31st of October, so it isn't closed quite yet. I'll submit as well. That one's always great. That's February time frame.
Dude, it says November 24th. Today's October 29th. I just forgot the month that we're in. That's all that happened.
Welcome to fourth quarter, right?
Oh gosh, wow. My face is red. It's always red, but it's extra red now. Wow. All right. Embarrassing.
All right.
Cool.
Well, before we do introductions with Scott and get into his background really quick, because we do want to be cognizant of his time, this episode is sponsored by Redpoint Security. Redpoint specializes in code security by coders, which is bolstered by years of experience testing applications and conducting code reviews against all types of applications. Redpoint also offers secure code training to help ground your teams in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information and put your company on a path to better security. So thanks to Redpoint for sponsoring today. Yeah, let's get into it. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I know we have been talking to Scott for a number of months to get him on. There's some really interesting projects that he's working on that are very relevant to code security specifically and practice, code review. So we're going to dive into that here shortly. But before we do that, Scott, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Where do you currently work? What's your current position? And then we can dig into your background from there.
Yeah, I'm currently working at CDW. I forget what my exact title is, Principal Application Security Engineer, something like that. I am working to really mature their application security program. So they had a program that was up and running before I came, but I'm really looking to make it more operational, and rather than just do scanning, actually put in processes and make sure that are circling back and fixing some of the things that we're finding.
Okay. No, that's great. Oh, and this is a common theme. I'll be honest, and this is a great place to actually see the industry, right? Ken and I often talk about our early days in where it was only scanning was application security. But the more companies I deal with and the more people that I talk to nowadays from an AppSec perspective. So you are an AppSec engineer, you're trying to build out a program, you're doing more than just running the tools and doing false positive analysis. You're actually trying to affect the overall security of the applications, right? So what have been your challenges? So you're at CDW now. You're an application security engineer. What are the current challenges that you see over there that may be novel or even similar to other people in the industry?
I think the challenges that CDW faces are pretty similar to what I've seen elsewhere, in just that not enough security engineers for the sheer number of apps that we have. Uh-huh. And so I can do a lot if I have an app, a team, go in, do a deep dive, and get the app pretty solid.
Yeah.
But there are 3 of us and over 1,000 apps. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do to help keep CDW secure? So it stops being about doing individual assessments and individual penetration tests, which I've done before. I've been a consultant. I've done that. I certainly can do that. But it becomes about how do I leverage my time to fix the most issues with the least amount of effort, just because there are so many apps. And then where do I focus my time? How do I train the developers? And which also gets into how do I train developers to be able to do their own security? Because again, with 3 of us with over 1,000 apps, we just can't monitor individual apps.
Yeah, and I'm with you, because this is a traditional security problem, right? Hey, we've got all this content, we've got everything that's coming out of the organization, and we have limited resources to actually secure it. So there's got to be ways. We've got to come up with strategies to amplify our skills to actually secure things. But before we get into some of the tools and things that I know you've built and we've done that, what was your path to get into application security? Where did you start? What's your training? How did you get to where you're at?
I actually have a music degree.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Awesome. What do you play? Sorry, like I'm gonna get yeah.
My main instruments were tuba and euphonium.
Okay.
Euphonium is just a little tuba for those of you who weren't in band.
Yeah.
And my first job coming out of college was repairing musical instruments. So I after getting my bachelor's degree, I went to a year in trade school and learned how to repair flutes, clarinets, tubas, trumpets, and for a couple of years spent repairing instruments. I thought that the repairing musical instruments was going to go the way that repairing TVs was. It's like, it's just a lot, something goes wrong, it's cheaper to throw away your existing TV than it is to get it fixed in most cases. And I was thinking that the instrument repair industry is going to do the same thing. And like, okay, I don't see much of a future here. I had started teaching myself software development, actually started teaching myself web development because I wanted to run a business buying used instruments, fixing them up and reselling them. I needed a website for that.
Yeah.
So I first created an HTML website and like, oh, I want a form. Wait, I have to do what in order for that form to actually do something? So I actually taught myself C++. This is 2004, 2005, and C++ was not the right language for that even then. But going off bad information, taught myself C++, and tried to get it. So after I started seeing the writing on the wall in the instrument repair industry, I tried to get a job as a C++ programmer, and nobody was interested. And then I learned more about web development, got into C#, got a job in a music store where I was doing some web stuff and some band instrument repair stuff and some instrument sales, which was my stepping stone into my first programming job in 2006. And 2008, read a book on security, started doing minor penetration tests on the apps that I was writing. And sometimes I would inherit a code base from another person on the team or sometimes another company. One of the company I was working at the time did a lot of rescue projects. So software development company creates an app. They don't do a very good job. We come in, we turn it around. So I saw a lot of different code bases. Did a little bit of penetration testing, gradually worked into security. Got my first job where security was in my title in 2017. So people ask me, well, how many years of security do you have? Security experience do you have? It's like, I don't know. Did I start in 2008? Did I start in 2017? Somewhere in between? I don't know. But been working in security since 2017, mostly after I moved to Seattle and found that the tech scene in Seattle is very different than in the places I've been living before, which is Chicago and DC. Chicago and DC, I was a fairly seasoned senior guy. Seattle, I'm competing against people who have been at Microsoft and Amazon longer than I've been in IT. It's just a different world out here. So I needed a way to differentiate myself, used security as a way to do that. Been doing security ever since.
Cool. That's fascinating to me. And I love that, like the different backgrounds that we see, right? Like you talk, music, and I mean, yeah, it's near and dear to my heart because my son just started college and he's a saxophone player and is doing music performance, and and we've been having discussions about the repair route as well. So I'm going to make him listen to the podcast just because you're on it. So that's great. Yeah. But outside of that, it sounds like it's not necessarily a traditional path into what we would think of as a traditional path into security. Right?
I mean, one thing I like is that you actually started with actually looking at code. It's usually the opposite, right? Where folks are starting with, dynamic penetration testing style activities, and then get maybe into the code bit later, like source code analysis. Why I'm saying that is you had mentioned, in 2008, I might have started, in 2017, I might have started. But I would argue that if in 2008, you're reviewing code base after code base. You're starting to, at that point, formulate, whether it's security or whether it's functional, analysis. You're starting to formulate a methodology for how you actually pick apart and review code bases to understand them a little bit better. So I would argue that in 2008, you started the honing of that craft, even though your title in 2017 was maybe, or that was the first time you had that title.
Yeah, and I agree. And it's just when I talk to HR types that they're like, well, your first job, security job. But that actually leads me into one of my personal annoyances with application security as a whole, is that we need more people in application security who've written code.
Yes.
A lot of the people that I talk to who have done the penetration testing and who haven't written the code don't necessarily know how to explain to developers how to fix the problem. And one of the most common complaints when I talk to developers about what are their annoyances with security is that, the security folks can't explain to us in terms that we can understand what the vulnerability is and how to fix it. Like, and then they tell us how to recreate it in these tools that we've never heard of, and we just don't know what to do with it. And I've posted on LinkedIn a couple of times about it, and some of the folks who didn't have coding experience, well, yeah, I can tell software development teams to parameterize their queries for SQL injection, for example. And it's like, yeah, great advice for 15 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are these things called ORMs now, which means that most developers don't write their own SQL queries anymore. It still happens. SQL injection still happens. And there are still, every once in a while, bugs in ORMs where SQL injection happens. I saw something in Hibernate. This was at least 5 years ago. So it happens. But if you're saying parameterize your queries and they're using ORM, your advice is basically useless. So we need more people who are in AppSec who understand the code, who can talk to the developers so they can actually fix the things. Because just saying, hey, I found a bunch of stuff, tossing it over the wall over to the developers and hope it gets fixed seems to be the strategy that a lot of people are following, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and it's not just replication; it's remediation advice too, right? Like I guess you mentioned two things. One with parameterized queries is more around the remediation side of how to actually fix the vulnerability. That's one side, but the second is well, I don't know if you actually meant that in remediation advice or just general advice. Okay. So then the other flip side of that would be, you're talking about maybe giving screenshots, maybe giving replication steps that are tied specifically to, like, I don't know, or Kaido or Zap or whatever different security tool. And that's a whole other different issue. So it's not explaining well how to replicate whatever thing you're saying is vulnerable in a way that a developer can use it. Like a curl command would be much easier, right, for them to understand than like burp screenshots and like use a repeater or use intruder in this way. And then you can, And the second part is like the remediation advice being pretty terrible. I've seen both sides be pretty awful myself. I'm sure, Seth, you've seen that as well, where it's not even relevant information to what's actually being assessed whatsoever. Stuff like what you're saying, Scott, where it's like, we'll just encode your outputs and sanitize your inputs. And it's like, where does that leave me? In what way does that help me in any case? So I definitely, I've felt that before.
Yeah. And it's part of me is a little discouraged to hear you say that too, Scott, because we've been talking about this since like 2007 and 8, right? Like as Ken and I were at Fishnet, like we kept saying the best AppSec engineers are ex-developers, or at least people that have coded in the past, right? When we're taking somebody that's coming directly from like a network scanning, like penetration testing background, that's what you're going to get is tool output, a little bit of validation that they like proved that the exploit existed. but the remediation advice becomes so generic that it's next to useless for a developer. Yeah. And so it's a little, for me, it's a little discouraging, but it's also like an opportunity, right? Like, so when you get into dealing with developers on a daily basis, right, you'd be surprised at the amount of times that they're just thankful that when we're giving them a report from like Redpoint, that we will give it to them in Markdown so they can just put it straight into Jira or into GitHub issues or whatever else instead of a PDF, right? Like just that level. And I'm like, this is like really basic stuff to make their lives easier. And yet like that's the level we're at. Yeah.
How do you guys think this happens, right? Do you think it's like a vetting issue, or do you think it's like an expectation issue? Maybe the expectation is just that, I don't know, you can run a scanner or something. And that's about it. I really don't know. Like I actually was thinking about it, and I don't know. Like, do you guys have any thoughts on how folks might be still kind of clueless? I mean, it's application security. It's in the name, right? Like, you should know how applications work.
I think part of the problem is just skills. It's easy to, doing a penetration test is one set of skills. Fixing the issues is arguably a second set of skills. And so if you can do a penetration test, and I've met people who can do penetration tests pretty well, who don't understand the code. Finding the issues is great, but then knowing how to fix the issues is a whole another ball of wax. And taking that a step further. So my background is ASP.NET. I've kind of fiddled with Java, I've fiddled with Ruby and Python, and I know something about all of those other languages. But if I'm looking at an ASP.NET app, and I know that there's a particular vulnerability, I know right away that, okay, here's where I need to look. Here's where likely the problem is, and here's how to fix it. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to Google it. I just know. With Java, Java is similar enough to C# and ASP.NET where I can figure it out pretty quickly. With Python, I look at Django, and Django looks like a whole different world, and I can figure it out. It just takes a lot longer. And having been a developer, knowing how hard it is to understand security is basically just a different language. I will do that research. And Seth, I've seen you talk about that too. I think you were talking specifically about a SQL injection vulnerability in, I think it was Ruby, where you had to do some research as to whether or not that was actually a SQL injection vulnerability. That takes time, it takes work, and it also takes knowing that might actually be a problem. Some methods will parameterize the queries under the hood without telling you. Some of them won't, and you have to know the frameworks. And if you don't know the frameworks, you have to do the research. And I think some people don't even know enough to ask the question.
I think that's when I was thinking about where you said there's being able to find the issue like through, and I assume, like dynamically, not in a source code review, because and I'll explain that in a second. So there's finding the vulnerability. That's the one side. The other is the remediation aspect. In between those two spots, there is root cause. Like, what's the root cause analysis? Now, I'd argue if you don't have source code in front of you and you're just doing like a penetration, like a dynamic penetration test, it might be actually hard for you to, if not impossible, to even understand what the root cause of what you just found is. So like, you can find the issue. You don't know necessarily why that's occurring. If you don't know why that's occurring, that's going to make your remediation advice pretty difficult. And then going back to your example of saying something along the lines of, well, just, parameterize your queries. Yeah, it's like, it is kind of that thing where it's like, unless you're experienced enough to know like, hey, I'm doing this dynamic assessment. I don't have source code, but I can see that this is to your point, Ruby on Rails, or I can see that this is a Django framework based off of these different behavioral markers that tell me it is that, or maybe your client just told you that's what it is. In any case, you can maybe start to guess how it's going on or what's going on in the background with its ORM, but it's like you don't really know your advice. So and the reason I'm bringing this up is I was trying to think like, why is that advice so terrible still? And I could see that that's maybe the reason, is that you're doing a dynamic test. You don't know really how the code's working behind the scenes. So you don't really know the root cause of the true issue. So then your remediation advice is generic and pretty awful in general, which is, I think, what we've experienced. And I don't know if there's a way that you guys can think of to sort of, without access to source code, to sort of fix that a little bit. The only thing I could think of was like, hey, I have an idea of maybe the like I said, the behavioral stuff that tells me this is a certain type of framework, and so these types of issues are more likely to occur in these different ways, like XSS. Maybe it's a templating language thing, unsafe operators. If it's SQL injection, maybe an unsafe ORM method called unsafely, even stuff like that. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts there. I know it's a little dicey of a thought to navigate.
Yeah, Scott, I'll let you go first. Like, yeah.
I think that not having the source code is its own problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like
I would agree.
No matter what you do, that's just going to be a difficult problem to solve. I think what I would focus on is when you do have source code, you need to have the knowledge and the curiosity to be able to go into the source code and figure out, okay, where is this coming from? I think there are a lot of folks who just, SQL injection, parameterized queries. Cross-site scripting, input sanitization, which is its own problem because input sanitization doesn't fix cross-site scripting most of the time, but that's another story. I see this thing. Here's some generic advice, because if you're somebody who is doing Ruby one day, Python the next day, ASP.NET the next day, it is genuinely hard to write good remediation advice, because you have to either know those frameworks or do the time to research how those frameworks work. And every minute that you spend researching how those frameworks work is a minute that you're not doing penetration testing, finding more findings.
Yeah.
Well, I'm with you.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk about this in the in the secure code review course, right? Like that we spend when we're doing code reviews, especially in those languages that we're unfamiliar with, we spend a huge amount of time building applications, just like throwaway applications, just to see how things work. Researching, like looking into documentation, into recommendations. Like I spend so much time with Stack Overflow, or even with Chat GPT nowadays, right? Just asking how things are structured, how things are put together, because without that advice, I can't necessarily go to a developer in good conscience and say, hey, this is a vulnerability, this needs to be fixed, right? And then not only that, but it needs to be fixed in this way to eliminate the issue. It's one thing to talk about an ORM, but it's another thing when you're starting to talk about business logic flaws or template injection or, SSRF and the way that, the different libraries handle requests and input. It's just most code reviews is a research project. It's not necessarily just like, hey, I'm finding all these vulnerabilities. It's a research project. Yeah.
And then you get the apps that use the code in a non-standard way.
Yes. No, that never happens, right?
Actually, we talk about it sometimes in the course. It's like when you've reviewed enough applications, especially what you said earlier, Scott, where if you are very well versed in C# like you are and .NET, for you, it's easy to look at something and say that's an anti-pattern. That's a smell. That's based off of all the context I've ever gleaned about these types of applications and how they're written. And the same is true when you look at a code base and you say, like, one example we share in the course is, hey, this application looks like it was written by C# Java developers, but it's a Ruby language. And then you talk to in my case, it was a CTO, and you're like, well, who is your staff? And he's like, oh yeah, they're like ex Java C# developers, and yeah, they're writing a Ruby. And you're like, oh yeah, like boom. You kind of just, if you've done something long enough, it becomes easy to understand that. And I think like if you can extrapolate out sort of broader markers for, what types of, this is something we talk about in our secure code review course, which is heavily what our methodology is built off of, which is like, if you understand the ways in which things go wrong in different languages and frameworks, you may not know right off the bat. And it's like Seth and you were saying, it becomes a bit of research, but if you know like typically how things happen in one framework and language, you can start to look for other ways those same types of things manifest in whatever new thing that you're looking at. But it does take time. I think these days and I know nobody wants to hear this, but I do think LLMs help in that way. I also think obviously going to the documentation on the different frameworks and languages, sites and libraries helps as well. It is a thing of like knowing something in depth does certainly help help your review.
It does. And Ken, to get back to your question about like, why is it that we're still seeing that, right?
Right.
And, why is that occurring? I still think that we've got, number one, in the industry, we have this focus on exploitation, right? As opposed to mitigation. As much as we talk about shift left, and we talk about like getting involved in the development process, training developers, like all that sort of thing. The focus is always on, hey, how was I able to breach and exploit this? Those are the popular articles. Those are the popular mechanisms. So that is what the executives hear. So they want to make sure that they can't get exploited because they don't want to show up in the papers, or they don't want to show up on Gartner, or whatever it is. And to do that, they've been taught that they just have to check that pen testing box, right? From a dynamic perspective. So I like that. At least that's my fill, right? I don't know. I mean, Scott, you're embedded with an organization, right? Like obviously, CDW is investing in application security. Like what are your thoughts when it comes to that sort of like macro view of what's going on?
So focus on penetration testing, exploitation rather than code.
Yeah.
You
can disagree. That's
fine. I think it's largely because people who are in security come from more of an exploitation rather than a remediation background.
Okay.
I think there are more people in security who come from that. Is at least from my point of view, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, that there are a lot of people in AppSec who were penetration testers, not coders, not the other way around. I think a lot of coders would come at it from a remediation point of view, but there aren't enough coders in AppSec, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a good take on it, right? Because like we're still seeing that, and I don't know, in security in general, like if you identify a coder that's interested in security, bring them over, right? Like I guess that's the takeaway that I've got from this in general, is encourage them to make that jump. I mean, from a career perspective, I think both can be valid careers for sure, and you can do well. But if they've already got that security bent, we need them, right? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's talk. I know we've only got we didn't plan any of that, but this discussion has gone on for half an hour. So let's jump into the tools and what it is that you're doing from a .NET perspective. You talk about like, hey, you've concentrated on C# and .NET in your career. Is that because you started in C++, or was it just that you happen to like C#, .NET? Like, where did that come from?
It was, yeah, after I realized that C++ was not the way to go. I just discovered C#. I don't even remember at this point what led me to C# versus Java. But I had just found C#, and ever since then, it's just been the path of least resistance. Should I spend 40 hours creating a website in Java, or should I spend 8 hours creating in C#? And that's not saying that it's easier to create websites and that somebody who knows both equally would create something in C#. It just, every time I open up Eclipse, it's I spend tens of minutes just figuring out how to do even the simplest things. And it's like in Visual Studio, I'm editing configuration files that to the level of knowledge. So I've just stayed in C#. I like I said, I've poked around a couple of things. I took some machine learning courses, 2014, 2015. Most of those are in Python, and that wasn't really a problem. But at the same time, it's just whenever I do stuff on my own, if I'm not just fiddling around with something, it's just, I write it in C# because it's just a lot easier.
Yeah. Yep. And that's what you'll find, right? Like, the language that you're most comfortable with, or the IDE, is what you turn to when you need to get something done. In most courses, when I talk to developers, that's the first question I ask is like, hey, what is your preferred language? Because that kind of tells me how we can have that discussion, but it also tells me what their background is, right? Like from a, startup land, if I hear Rails or I hear, Ruby, Python, even TypeScript, that's mostly, startup, like newer, not necessarily that it's bad, and but that's typically the startup world, as opposed to .NET, Java. Okay, that's like you came up in a corporate environment, you were involved with some of these bigger companies at some point. And then if you say PHP, I just shake my head and say sorry. I say that, but I've also programmed stuff in PHP. So yeah.
Before I went to CDW,
challenges.
I was running my own business, and the idea that I had to create a business was a monitoring tool, kind of like IAST, but performance error monitoring, traffic monitoring on top of that. And they did a plugin in WordPress as well as ASP.NET. I was not pleased with what I found.
Yes.
I think WordPress needs to die.
You say that, and yet it runs like what, 1/3 of the internet, maybe even more than that, right? Like the number of marketing sites.
50%.
Yeah,
it's something very disheartening.
Yes, it is. Yes, I mean, part of me understands because it's easy to get up and running, right? Like the CMS, it's just the CMS that's taken over the world. That's, yep. But okay, but let's go back to C# and .NET, because I do want to talk about Code Sheriff, right? The tool that is coming from you. It's out on GitHub. We posted the link. It's a SAST tool for .NET. But what brought you to actually creating a SaaS tool there, right? Like we know that there's commercial offerings and other things, but so the open source version that you've created, where did this come from?
Yeah, and I've been wanting to, well, even back in my instrument repair days, I was thinking that I was going to run a business. So I've been wanting to go out on my own for decades now. But even during that time, one of the things that I thought is I will never create a SaaS tool because there are too many commercial options out there. There's too much competition.
Uh-huh.
What ended up happening in 2023, so I tried to run a business. Nobody was buying the product. Tried to sell consulting services, was not getting much interest there. And so, okay, how do I get noticed? And one of the things that I thought of was doing a comparison between existing SaaS tools on the market. Doing the comparison because I've heard you guys talk about it in the program before, and I agree 100%. Gartner's analysis are just,
yeah.
they're there.
It is analysis, yes.
So I wanted to do an in-depth analysis of SaaS tools to be able to say that SaaS tools really are not created equally. I was talking about this in the Slack group a couple of months ago. I guess it was a year ago at this point, talking about the differences between the SaaS tools. And somebody posted that, oh, if you want this, go with SonarGrid. If you want this, go with SendGrid. If you want API integration, go with this one. And none of them were if you want the best scan. And I talked to so many people who just assume that all of the scanners do an equally good job. And my experience is that's not the case, that scanners do a wildly different quality of job on the scan itself. And I wanted to do a published study that actually showed that and actually quantified that. So I had an intentionally vulnerable website. It's in the same repository as Code Sheriff. It's called Vulnerability Buffet. I had actually written that for a similar DAST comparison. I want to say 2017, 2018, somewhere in that ballpark. And unfortunately, the website has gotten kind of mangled because I've added things for training, and then I've added things for SaaS, and then it still has all the DASTy things in there. So it's not a single purpose website, but it is an intentionally vulnerable website. But I also know what all the vulnerabilities are. So as opposed to doing a comparison against a juice shop, I don't know all the vulnerabilities in juice shop, so I don't know what it misses. I wanted to be able to say in my analysis, well, the scanner caught these things, but it missed these things, and it had false positives here. Mm-hmm. So I did a comparison against all of the SaaS scanners that I could get my hands on. So which was any free version, anything free that was out there, free versions of commercial tools. I had one where I called in a favor with a vendor, which shall remain nameless since I'm not sure how many strings they had to pull. Yeah. And I did a comparison of all these SaaS tools and found out that I was actually not disappointed with Snyk. Snyk did an okay job, did what I thought was the minimum of what a scanner should be able to find in the websites. Again, knowing what was there, which would have been fine if Snyk were the worst of the lot, but Snyk was the best. Where all of the other scanners that I tried were what I thought were below what I thought the minimum standard should be. Some of them way below. So I had some 150 vulnerabilities, and that's not 150 unique vulnerabilities. It's just 150 vulnerabilities, because sometimes it gets a little strange if I just SQL injection via string builder over here, SQL injection versus string concatenation over here. And are those different vulnerabilities? I don't know. But 150 vulnerabilities, Snyk found 50, which is not good. But it found all of the minimum things, and everybody else was worse. And then there were some really big names in the industry that found single-digit vulnerabilities. I'm hoping that was because they were the free versions and the paid versions actually have a lot more rules, or that I just did something wrong in the scans or something. But single digits is really, really bad. Mm-hmm. And I was deeply disappointed.
Were those vulnerabilities like everywhere from low to high in criticality, or were they just...
Yeah. So
I was thinking maybe they wouldn't surface certain things that are like kind of low risk, but I don't know, maybe... I don't know.
Yeah, in that, so there's a sec tool, I think sectoolsmarket.com or something like that has a DAST comparison, and it's almost 10 years old at this point, and they had a lot of scanners that found 100% of the vulnerabilities in their test website. And I looked at that and was thinking, this is not a good test, because no scanner finds 100%. So one of the things that I designed in the website was, okay, here's the easy stuff. Every scanner should be able to find this. Here's the medium stuff. Most good scanners should be able to find this. And here's some hard things. And I'd be pleasantly surprised if you find these, but I think that you should be able to find these. So yeah, I did do some low, medium, and high vulnerabilities that are in there. And so after doing the comparison, after seeing all of the scanners do, quite frankly, a crappy job, except for Sneak, which is barely adequate, I was like, I'm trying to run a business. I don't have any clients. I have some spare time. I'm just curious, can I write a better one?
Mm-hmm.
And I did. The code sheriff finds pretty much all of the vulnerabilities that all of the other scanners find. And the ones that it doesn't find, I can put in a matter of hours. And I did it in a matter of weeks, which was, I don't know what that says about the current SAST industry, that someone can write a scanner that can find more true positives with fewer false positives in a matter of weeks than some of these commercial tools. But I did. And if anybody who's watching this, and you have the link, if any of you disagree, please let me know, and I would love to improve the tool. But that was my experience, that these SAST scanners just don't do a good job. So I wrote a better one.
Well, I know you said, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, keep it. You go for it, Ken. I'll dive in shortly.
No, I was going to say, I know you said that, well, it sounds like you're not sure why I phrase this. I'd really like to get to the root cause of why you think this might be the case, but it sounds like you're not even sure why legacy, or sorry, I keep calling them legacy SaaS tools. SaaS tools. Sorry. I'm not sorry. Honestly, sorry. I'll say this. I don't think they're going to stick around. I don't think in 5 years you're going to be seeing those tools operate the same way. But in any case, if you have any thoughts, it'd be awesome to share why you think maybe they fall down, and maybe or alternatively, what you might have done differently that allows you to analyze. And to be clear, this is just for .NET. So analyzing .NET applications better than, say, I'm not going to throw out vendor names because I just out of respect to you, I'd throw them out if it was just Seth and I. But
yeah,
with you on the call, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, any thoughts there at all?
Well, I think it depends a lot on the scanner, and how they're doing their analysis. What I did with my scanner, which makes it different than at least some of the scanners out there, is I used the Microsoft, I forget what it's called exactly. It was codenamed Roslyn when it came out 10 years ago. I think it's the Microsoft Compiler API now. But I used that to do my analysis. So it wasn't like, I'm not going to throw out the names of scanners right now. I will privately, but there are some scanners out there that basically do a text search, and they're very open about the fact that they do a text comparison and they analyze your class that way. There's only so far you can get with an analysis like that. What I can do with my scanner is I can say, give me every instance where a connection string is set in a connection object, and that connection object has to inherit from a SQL command or a OLEDB command, or there's an IBM. I think there are two others in there. And I can say, well, if that object inherits from one of those five, and the property, and I don't even have to look for the text, command text. I can say, is this a property? Is this property being set? I can say, give me the right side of that. Okay, where's the data coming from? All right, that's a string. Where's that string coming from? And then I can go back and I can say, find all references, and I can find all references recursively until I can actually find where the data is coming from. Another thing that I can do, another thing that the scanner does, is it looks to see, do you have a DB context object, which is the entity framework, which is the ORM that a lot of .NET users use. And I say, okay, all right, now I have the DB context object. Give me all of the DB sets, which is the collections of objects that map to tables. And okay, give me all of the objects that are in those DB sets. So then now I know what are the objects that are being used to connect to the database. So for instance, mass assignment. I was doing one of my annoyances with one of the scans that I had done in 2023 is that there was a false positive for a mass assignment. And I actually went back to the vendor and I said, you're going to get 96% false positives from this rule. Because you're just saying you're flagging this mass assignment as a vulnerability when that's just how programmers program. I took that as a challenge to say, okay, well, how can I really truly find mass assignments? And so that's when I went into the DB context, gave all the context objects. I can go in and say, this class, is this a controller class? And I can go in and I can say, does this controller class inherit from controller, even if it's 2, 3, 4 levels up? I can then go in and say, is data being set from the UI into this object and being saved to the database? Mm-hmm. And so I can do things like that. And it isn't just a simple analysis. It isn't just looking at this code as text. It's actually looking at the code as code, and using the compiler to understand the code as code. And that's what makes it different from a lot of the scanners out there.
And how do you because here's why I'm going to ask this question. So when we talk about mass assignment itself is not a vulnerability, right? It's a like, to your point, it's a programming heuristic. It's just a way to make, it's a convenience function. That's really what it is. So are you then saying there are certain types of objects that you could update through mass assignment that by naming convention are potentially insecure? Is that kind of like, meaning if I saw an admin, column value and that, or a role or something like that, and that I could tell that object could be mass assignable, that would, for me, be a bit of a trigger. But I don't know if you're saying, no, just blanket across the board. If it's taking, or if it's performing mass assignment, then it's potentially vulnerable in some way and we should flag it.
I actually don't remember how I implemented that one.
Oh yeah, sorry to get too much into the weeds, but I'm always curious. As somebody who full-time works on a scanning engine, yes, I am curious to ask these kinds of questions. But no, because that is a very important sort of, not just the mass assignment, but the concept of being able to map out sort of is this accessible? There are pitfalls I've seen with that. And maybe that's why vendors shy away from that. That could be a reason for some of it. Because I was thinking if you get a monolith code base, it's kind of easy to see where routes are configured, where to your point earlier, inputs coming in from a web form and all that, and basically the end-to-end flow and building out that graph. Where I see it fall down is when it's more like a service-oriented architecture. Maybe it's a microservice. There's not the same kind of simplicity. I don't want to say simplicity, but kind of simplicity in mapping all that out. And so then you see vendors just either get overly, noisy with saying, well, I don't know where the input's coming from. So, I don't know, it's probably vulnerable, maybe. Or the alternative to that is saying no, I'm just not going to report on it, which is arguably worse. And I've seen that lead to $20,000 to $30,000 bug bounties and some pretty nasty vulns. So I'm curious, have you dealt with yet non end-to-end monolith style apps where it's more service oriented kind of stuff, and seen some decent results there and whatnot?
I have not. So actually, when I was at Visa, one of the things that I did was take the Roslyn, I think it was Roslyn at that point. I'm still still in beta. One of the things that I needed to do was figure out for a change in the database, find all of the places that need to be updated. And one of the things that I did there was I did hop APIs. That was easy back then because Windows Communication Foundation had just come out. And so everything was on a more legacy web API formatting, the ASMX. And so given an ASMX, I could then go in the code base and actually find those files and then find out how they hop. It's a lot harder now. You don't need me to tell you that. It's a lot harder now.
Yeah, it is. It's also hard to get test cases for this stuff, at least. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. And so I haven't tried to do that. One of the things that the scanner in its current version does is, if I'm not 97% sure that this can be exploited, I don't report on it.
Nice.
One of the things that I was thinking about putting in was putting in a checkbox, just saying include suspicious items, and then just say, and then include in the output that yes, this looks exploitable because A, B, and C, and this looks suspicious. Looks like it might be exploitable, but I haven't found the path to how it could be exploited and have somebody look it through. But I haven't built that yet. But to your point, it's a difficult problem to solve, and I know you two have talked about this on the show before. Is that then just talking C# to C#, that's one problem. But if you're talking JavaScript to C#, that's a whole new world. I don't even know if it would be possible to say, I don't know if Selenium would do this, or just take an open source browser and actually have the browser interpret the JavaScript.
Headless browser, yeah.
And then turn that into something that you could analyze the same way that Roslyn analyzes C#. Those are some of the ideas that I was tossing around in my mind. But you go from a problem that's this big to a problem that's huge.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's part of the problem that we've had with the legacy SaaS tools, is they were built for very specific reasons 20 years ago, right? Like on very specific kind of like assumptions that we've since blown through. And then they just keep trying to retrofit. Okay, like, oh, can I pull Python into this, right? Or Ruby's popular now, instead of going back to, hey, what's available now, right? Like with Roslyn, or, what we saw Justin Collins do with Brakeman on Rails, right? Like, that sort of analysis is very specific to a singular language and framework. And it gives you such better results than, hey, I'm trying to have one hammer and hit all the nails with it.
Yeah, and you have someone like Scott who's got this deep expertise, who comes in and says, okay, I'm going to do SAST, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently in the way that I've seen it done before. So I'm going to take my domain expertise for this platform along with some new techniques and technology that's available. And you combine that together and you get beautiful things with like much better results. And that's kind of like, actually, so you had said that Sneak did the best, right? You said about 50 out of 150.
Yeah.
And what can, like, juxtaposition wise, what number does Sheriff Builder Code Sheriff? Jeez, man, I don't know. Too much caffeine, I think, today. But yeah, how are your numbers? I would assume they're like higher, performing much better.
Yeah, and one of these days I really need to actually count, but it'd be somewhere around 120.
There you go. Right.
Yeah, and even then, it's like I could get more. Like the DOM-based cross-site scripting, I'm not going to be able to do because JavaScript don't have that available. But I have the vast majority of the rest, And in most of the rest that I haven't put in, it's just like, do people even really see these anymore? Like XML external entities, like that died in .NET like 10 years ago. Do I need to put in a check to make sure that somebody didn't actually actively set I forget the property that you have to set in order to make that a vulnerability again?
Yeah.
No, it's not worth my time. I'm not going to bother.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there are more checks that I could put in, but at this point, it's diminishing return. So I'm honestly just waiting. I wrote this tool just to see if I could.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so at this point, I'm waiting for people to say, you know what, it'd be really cool if you could add this or do that. And then I can in my head say, oh, I could do that and then put it in. So far, there's really only been one feature that somebody's asked for, and I just haven't had the time to put it in, and it's the ability to write your own rules. And I think I could do that fairly easily if you're okay with fairly simple rules. But yeah, I just haven't had the time yet.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, because I'm seeing your tool, I'm seeing other open source tools come out. They're all performing this kind of scanning in different ways, but all more effective, it seems like, anyways, from the initial results. It's harder, obviously. There is some level of difficulty because of how many different types of applications are out there. I'm not talking about even like the C# probe, for instance. There's like many different types of use cases and developed apps with different components and all that, right? It's an art as much as it is also engineering. So maybe those tools on a broader scale perform better in some scenarios, but on the whole, what I'm hearing, and I'm just trying to remain somewhat objective and scientific here, but on the whole, what I hear is, oh, open source tool X does whatever better than this thing I was paying for. So it makes me wonder, like, what is if that's true, and on the whole they're performing better, what is the reason that like these larger vendors are investing
Gartner,
or at least
oh, sorry.
I mean, what's going on? Why are they getting outshined by somebody in a basement? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense to me, but it seems to be the case.
What I see, this isn't a comment about my tool at all. It's just a comment of what I see in AppSec. Is just there's a lot, not necessarily the absolute AppSec group, but AppSec more broadly as a whole, very, very in the box thinkers. And let me look for this tool. Hey, we did a scan. It found things. It's doing its job. And not thinking about, we found things. Would another tool find more? Or if I'm comparing SAST scanners, should I look at things other than just the list of features that they say? Or think, like, you can even see things like in the OWASP top 10, which I think is a complete, utter, total mess. Like the people who are making the OWASP top 10 are not thinking about the metrics that are behind it. I think it's just a lot of people going with the flow, going with what's easy, where more people should be questioning, is this the right thing to do? Should we be using these types of tools? Is there a better way of doing this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say that with the OWASP top 10, I have seen more in the last edition. There was more, I felt like there was a bit. Seth, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Brian and some other folks, aren't they working on the metrics collection behind that? The issue is actually getting
crap. Yeah.
Right, because they thought it was crap, like you, Scott. But then I remember hearing that one of their issues is, and also there's the question of, like, should we be using OWASP top 10 in that capacity? But that's a different question. I think one of their issues was getting vendors, believe it or not, to actually produce statistical information from that for them, as well as obviously corporations. So that's always been a limitation for the OAuth, or at least in the last iteration, and I think the one before that, is getting these folks to actually produce like hard stats. It's just very difficult to collect, it seems like. But back to your point, OWASP top 10 itself isn't like the end all be all of where real issues also lie. And it's kind of like sometimes it's also just dependent on the type of tech stack that you're using. Some things are going to affect one tech stack more than another.
And that's what I wanted to get to from a corporate perspective, right? Like you start talking not necessarily about the application security engineers, but we're talking about like the CISOs and the C-suites that go and read on Gartner or whatever, hey, I've got to do application security, and are being told, oh, if you go with one of these broad tools, it'll cover every use case that we need, right? And that's where we get things like some of those older SaaS tools that they cover every language under the sun poorly, but at least they cover every language under the sun, so I can check the box that, hey, I have SAST, right? Like I'm good, and PCI or whatever else, I can tell them that I do this, it's accepted, and I move on. It becomes that business to cost, or the business purpose to cost analysis that they end up doing. And even though there's a better way, and our AppSec engineers probably know that, they're not given the time, they're not given the funds to actually go at it. And so it becomes an education issue. Like there's just so many factors that feed into it that I as a consultant, I struggle to have that conversation with people, because I walk in and I'm like, you're a Rails shop. Why are you using this old like SaaS tool to try and scan Ruby? Right? We know that it does this poorly, and there's other options available. And they don't really have an answer outside of, well, this is the way that we've done it for the last 15 years. Right?
Not a great answer.
It's not, but that's still the answer that I get. Right.
And in fairness to them, I mean, decision fatigue is a thing. It's real. I mean, you can only question so many things in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year. And some things you just have to take for granted. I wish that tool choice weren't one of those things that people would take for granted, but at the same time, I understand it.
Yeah. And I don't want to leave the podcast on a nihilistic note, right? Because it is getting better. Like the fact that we're seeing tools like yours pop up from the open source community. Like I fully expect that to push the commercial tools to get better, or at least adopt some of the techniques that you're using in the open source, on the open source side of things. But we have been going for over an hour. So we probably want to put a bow on it a little bit. I don't know, like Scott, from your perspective, what should someone do? Like, how should they go about approaching like your tool or SAST in general then in these cases to make it more effective?
First thing, don't take the results for granted. Do some comparisons if you can. If you're evaluating SaaS tools, do some comparisons between them. Look for both true positives and look for false positives. See which ones work better for your environment and for your code base. If you can, and I know this gets expensive, but run multiple. One of the things that I tried to build actually back in 2017 was a tool that would run multiple tools and combine all of those, and with the idea that no one tool is going to find everything, and if multiple tools find something, then you can prioritize it higher. And one of the areas where I actually don't know much about is I've heard that there's a lot you can do with tuning SAST scanners and creating your own rules. I can't speak to that very well. Maybe you two have more experience with that than I do, but I've also heard that if you want to get the most out of your SaaS tools, you have to be able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general that's pretty good advice, but I think that goes back to your point of how it's been set up initially, right? Like the initial scans that you did with those tools, the results that you were seeing are very much in line with, hey, they just have no context, right? They have no idea what's going on. The false positives are, there's a huge number of them, or it wasn't designed for this specific framework and language, or we're doing things in an outdated manner. So, well, good. Scott, if people have additional questions, where can they find you? Where can they, talk to you about it?
I am on Slack. Otherwise, linkedin.com/in/Scott Norberg. feel free to send a connection. Note is always helpful, but send a connection, and as long as you look plausible, I'll accept, and you can contact me there.
All right, good deal. And we'll take the wider discussion about like rules and setting up SaaS tools and everything else like that into Slack from here. But we really appreciate your time today. It's been a joy to talk. It's been very informative and interesting. So
and thanks for having me.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
Yeah, thanks for letting us pepper you with questions. So.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Otherwise, I think I'm not going to belabor the point today. Thanks everybody for joining us. Find us on Slack. If you're interested in the LLM training, please sign up. Those signups are available now. And
it's next week, so hurry.
Yeah, it's hurry.
Yeah, no, I was just saying next week, so hurry. Cool. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you online.